This conference will now be recorded.
Welcome. Here we are again, Torah portion Emor, as we are inching near the end of Leviticus, or maybe I should say we are centimetering near the end for our friends in the UK. And Emor, roughly translated, means say. Let's just start with a prayer, since we're not going to be going through the psalm today. Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King. Titen lanu Adonai ki anachnu yochalim lemishtamesh toda lecha. Please help everyone here, help us all to feel gratitude today, that we can have the gratitude for the times we live in, the amazing technology we have access to. And we have electricity that we can use, we have fans we can use. Thank you for not making us Karaite Jews who are unable to have a fan on the Sabbath day and must sweat and suffer. We're so grateful to you. Please touch my tongue, touch my mouth. Help me to have ideas and connections maybe I didn't see in preparing, that I might serve your community, serve your people. I just ask, Father, that everyone here, that you would touch their hearts and that you would send forth your healing and your love and your truth on everyone. B'zchut Yeshua. Okay, so let's get going. The Torah portion for today is Leviticus chapters 21 through 24, and the Haftarah is Yeschiel chapter 44 verses 15 through 44 verses 31. An overview, because I know you all read it, but I just want to make sure it hasn't escaped from your mind. Sometimes when we read, we drift off. This parasha talks about Pesach, and Chag HaMatzot, Bikurim, and Shavuot, which we're counting down to still, and the Feast of Trumpets, of course, Yom Teruah, Yom HaKippurim, and Sukkot. So really there's a lot that could be discussed in this parsha. We could basically talk about any of the holidays we feel like talking about, but I'm not going to do that. I think you guys are pretty well versed in the holidays and why we do them and what they're about, and we always have a discussion about them when the holidays fit as well. So I was led in a different direction, so hopefully that'll be okay with everyone. Please feel free to chime in, type questions, comments as we go along, yeah? All right, so let's just get started here. Vayomer Adonai el Moshe. Then Adonai said to Moshe, now here we have in quotes, Emor el ha-kohanim b'nei Aharon. Say to the Kohanim. So this is a softer instruction than Daber, according to our sages. Say to the Kohanim, the sons of Aharon, ve'amarta alehem, and specifically say to them, lenefesh lo yitama be'admaiv. This is kind of a hard thing to translate here. It's very terse, and well, let's just look at it literally. A soul, for a soul, meaning a person, right, shall not yitama, shall not become tameh, shall not become unclean, impure, right? And again, be careful not to translate this ritually impure. This is something that I really hate, and I haven't seen commentaries complaining about it. I don't understand why not. You guys know me, and you know that my feeling is that the most important aspect of understanding Scripture, before reading commentaries, before reading what Chazal have to say even, although this is useful in this aspect, before anything, is understanding exactly what the text says. And this is why we cannot depend just on translations. The translations, they all have their own worldview, their own biases, right? My translations of things have my own bias, my own worldview. It's impossible to translate perfectly without having a bias injected or without losing something. right? We're translating from Hebrew, oftentimes 3,000-year-old texts or more, 4,000-year-old texts, into a language which did not even exist at the time, right? A totally different family. And even the development of the language of English itself was heavily influenced by Protestant ideals, right? And we don't have to get into the wickedness of Martin Luther. You all know about that already. But that's the spiritual father of Protestantism, right? A very wicked man. And so the language itself in its spiritual realm oftentimes was even influenced by this. So when we read the translation, we really are beholden to the translators. I've said it before. I want to say it again in case you never heard it or someone hears this on YouTube. The great physicist and rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, he was fond of saying, all translation is commentary. So when you're reading a translation, you are reading someone's commentary, even if there are no commentary notes. It's their perspective on what it says or what they want you to think it says. So they don't have to be diabolical, but maybe they are. I mean, who can say? Is it diabolical to try to get believers in the God of Israel to be disobedient? Is it diabolical to try to convince people to continue to sin that grace may abound? Is it diabolical to try to get people to be on a narrow path? Who can say? Who can say? I know that many translators, they really love God and they have a heart for these things, but they have the rabbinical status that we would call kidnapped from childhood. There's a rabbinical axiom that discusses, and this is intended for a Jewish person, right? But I'm coming from the perspective of understanding through the apostolic writings that even those who were born ethnoi as Gentiles, that through the blood of Messiah, they have been grafted in, right? They have been brought into the politia of Israel, the commonwealth, the government, the label of Israel. And so, from that perspective, I'm going to treat them as Jews. So, what this rabbinical axiom says is that if a Jewish person, a person beholden to Torah, was kidnapped by Goyen when he was a child and was taught to eat polluted foods and to violate Shabbat and to all these things, it's a different kind of judgment for that person. You see, it's that Hashem, who delights in mercy, treats that person differently. So a person living in sin accidentally, many of the sins can be demoted to the status of shogega, like an ignorant sin. Not all. The peshaim, there's not much room for wiggling with the aseret dabarot, the lo tirtzach, not murdering, and these sorts of things, right? Because there are some sins that all of humanity just knows in their gut is wicked. Right? This is why I mentioned before in Japan, the most wicked sins we don't see done there, with the exception of perhaps suicide. I mean, on the scale of other societies, even though they do not have the Torah, they have the blueprint of God within them, they understand. And so, in this case of the person who's been kidnapped from birth, they have this status, these theologians, these translators, they're beholden to errant lexicons, they're beholden to an errant system of thinking. Yea, even a system of thinking where you will be punished severely for thinking differently. I remember when I was a university student in Boston, and I used to attend a Messianic synagogue in a nearby town, and one of the elders at the synagogue he used to be a Methodist preacher. And it's very interesting. He told me, he explained that he was working on I said, how did you come to Torah? What happened? And he explained to me that he was working on his master's degree at a seminary, and he couldn't shake the lack of reason in the sense of having the Bible been abrogated, so to speak, right? Like I'm intentionally using this term that Muslims use, where they say that in the Quran, you have something earlier on which is given, and then later on the Quran contradicts itself, and they'll just say, "Oh, that earlier verse was abrogated," right? So we don't have this in the Bible. There's no contradictions. But for sure, there are theological abrogations where people say, well, those previous verses don't apply anymore. And he couldn't shake it because as he studied deeper and deeper and he got into Hebrew, and I can see his face in my mind right now, full bearded guy, nice, funny, laughing fellow, but I can't remember his name to give credit. But he said, as he studied the Hebrew and he got deeper, he came across terms like le'olam ba'ed, forever and ever, the dor vador, from generation to generation, all these eternal type commands. he couldn't shake the feeling that it was wrong to be trying to escape from Torah. And as he started to ask questions and voice his opinions, well, he got expelled from his university. So, and he landed with us. He ended up with Messianic Judaism. And so this is the way it is for many of those who are kidnapped as children. And I think for those of you who have the Torah, which is most of you listening now, and also the Mashiach, we have to have a kind of pity for those that are in that position. Instead of looking down on them from our high hill with haughty eyes that we are so great and you're a bunch of idiots, we need to instead understand that they have been kidnapped theologically. They've been kidnapped. I mean, think, there isn't really a Gentile tradition of Christianity that you could choose that doesn't come from some horrible, wicked, murderous spiritual father, right? I mean, maybe you're Swiss. You say, well, we're not from Martin Luther. We have a different spiritual father. Okay, well, the predetermination guy also had those who disagreed with him murdered, right? So, for some reason, his name escapes me right now. If anybody wants to type it, that would be a great help. I can't believe I can't remember. One of the reformers who was the predestinationist. Golly, I can't believe I forgot his name. Anyway, so if you're Roman Catholic, well, of course, there's a horrible history there as well. And not to mention all the pedophilia scandals and just the horrible, by their works you shall know them, which Yeshua has warned us about. If you're from the Eastern Orthodox, well, there's the horrible stain of anti-Semitism on that church, not to mention astrology, which is often endorsed. I remember walking into an Eastern Orthodox church in Moscow. I was curious one time, and I went into this one church where I was curious because it was famous, because the priest who founded that particular church, again, Eastern Orthodox, this is the group of Christianity which is older than Roman Catholicism. The Bishop of Rome rebelled against the Orthodox Church and started his own new thing, right? And one of the things he was frustrated with the Orthodox Church was that they were doing things the way that Jews did them, right? So, for example, they made sure that the Easter always fell on the Passover, right? And these other sort of things. And he was very anti-Semitic, the Bishop of Rome, who broke away from the Eastern Church. But over time, people are people, and churches are influenced by their congregants, and so even the Orthodox Church became highly anti-Semitic for some centuries. And this one church that I went to in Moscow, the founder of the church was a priest who loved Jews. He had a heart for Jews and for winning Jews to the Messiah. And I was just curious, so I walked into that church, and it was amazing, a Russian Orthodox church, and the greeter said shalom. When I walked in, it was something else. It was bizarre. Like, imagine this happening like at a Roman Catholic church or something. And so what I like about the Orthodox, they don't have statues, right? So it's already a little less than like if you go to a Catholic church and it just feels like you're in a demonic location, right? You don't have that quite same feeling with the Orthodox. They have their icons, but it's a different level of, I don't know how to explain it. Statues just really creep me out when you've got statues of saints and stuff and people are lighting candles to them, and it's just creepy. But in the Eastern Orthodox, in this particular place, I was asking about the history, and it turned out that this priest was axe murdered because he was too friendly to Jews. That's right, a priest was axe murdered because he was too friendly. He was trying to win Jews to the faith, and of course, well, you should let Jews be damned to hell. That's the way things should be. So of course, a priest should be axe murdered. So anyway, while I was there, it was really interesting. I have to say, it was interesting to see their perspective, and they made sure they used a lot of Hebrew terms and stuff, which is very strange for Eastern Orthodox, which usually they lean on the Greek more than anything else. And then when I was about to leave, I saw in the back there was a table with a bunch of literature, and there was a lot of astrology stuff. And I thought, yuck, that's too bad. That's really too bad, including like predicting your daily horoscope and stuff like this. And so yeah, so they're trying, but the problem is all of these denominations people don't realize it, but they've been kidnapped since their youth. Even great theologians, they were kidnapped since their youth. Do you really want to be the guy that's asking the questions, working on your PhD, and you've been working on it for 3 years, plus the 2 years for your master's, plus the 4 to 5 years for your bachelor's degree, and now you're about to get a job in your denomination. You're about to work and support your family. You're hanging on. You got kids, and you start to ask questions about Torah, and then, hey, don't do that. Remember, so-and-so was expelled for asking those questions. This is American university, American seminary, all right? The Methodists, who are supposed to be quite liberal, they're actually having a schism right now because they accept homosexuality among men. And some of the other Methodists, the old school types, are not into that. And so they're about to break off into two groups. This upcoming schism's been coming for a couple of decades now. But, so look, every denomination has its baggage, right? And so we have to be a little bit merciful when we speak to people or when we think about people. We think about where they're coming from. Their minds are in stronghold positions. They're not allowed to think outside the box. And someone who keeps kosher, for example, is seen as the weaker brother, the weaker sister, right? So even if they permit you to observe the law, they misinterpret verses, again, because they are theological captives. They've been kidnapped since childhood. Because of these things, they judge you as being the weaker one, right? You might know the Bible in the original languages entirely, and you might know all the commentaries, but you're weaker because you're obedient to God's law. You see how crazy it is? But this is what we're up against. This is what we're up against. And it's interesting for Hebrew roots, who are oftentimes allies to us, and the Messianic movement, who sometimes are not, we have two groups that we're trying to win, really. One, we're trying to win people to the Messiah so that they might be saved, so that they might have a place in Olam Haba. But we're also trying to win those who are living in disobedience because we don't want them to be called least in the kingdom of heaven, whatever that means. We don't want them to be there and be humiliated. We don't want them to be in a situation where their lives are not as significant as they could be. And so reaching out to them, we have to have this when we give an olive branch, when we reach out to them, we have to be very careful. One, to not cast our pearls before swine, and two, to approach them with some level of humility. I have a friend who is a Messianic minister, and he about a month or two ago, he had a private discussion with his pastor. He attends a Pentecostal church, and he's well known at the church because, well, he knows the Bible better than the pastor, right? And he does little study groups and stuff. And he met with the pastor, and they were talking about the Torah, and they would do this from time to time. And the next Sunday, the pastor gave a scathing speech about how weak the brother is who keeps the Torah, just to everybody, right? And my friend and his wife, they're just having to sit there and eat crow, we say in the South. They're just sitting there eating crow. It was so clearly a polemical attack against him because the pastor had been embarrassed. He was soundly defeated in the discussion that they had, right? Even though this guy's a very humble guy, the way he approaches people. But that's what happened. And so he told me recently this week that he met with the pastor and discussed such and such. And, the pastor's got his answer. And I told him, I said, look, I hate to see you wasting your time. You're really casting your pearls. I think you're casting your pearls before swine. Because some people, the ego's too big and they're not going to hear it, right? So we have to make a judgment about what is the person going to waste the time? Are they just going to throw it in our face? Because really it's dangerous for them as well. In a way, it's better for them to remain theologically captive and ignorant than to hear the truth and reject it, because then it's a greater danger. We don't know how God will judge. Only God knows. But once someone knows the truth, they know about not living, about the threat that Yeshua makes, depart from me, those of you who work anomia, those who work meaning not, nomia, related to nomos, the law, you who work against the law. Again, it's a scary verse. And so, in a way, it's better for them to be ignorant sometimes. If you know the personality won't listen to you, let them remain a captive. So here we have this interesting verse, bringing it back. Lo yitama ba'al be'amav lehechalo. So, do not ever translate this as do not let him make himself ritually impure, because there is no such phrase in the Bible as ritually impure. This is something which those theologians who were kidnapped since childhood, they insert because they're trying. The only way they can get away with not keeping the law, oftentimes, is to put a wedge, right, between what is the moral law and what is just about ritual, right? What is the quote-unquote cultic laws? The scholars will refer to a lot of the laws in Leviticus, the holiness code, right? The cult. What is the cult doing? Not meaning cult like, Jehovah's Witness or something, or Mormons, but cult meaning like cultic, meaning what happens in the service of the temple. So we have to shy away from that. We have to make sure that the language that we use is appropriate. You should not be saying ceremonially unclean. Okay, there's only unclean. Watching something terrible on the internet or reading Lashon Hara, it makes you unclean, and touching a dead thing makes you unclean. Right? Eating pig makes you unclean. Right? It's the same spiritual state of being. Then Adonai spoke to Moshe, saying, and here you can just read it in English if you like. That's my translation. The yellow is quite tricky, so the way I translated it is, he shall not pollute himself as a husband among his kin to profane himself. When you read my translations, anything in italics is not in the text, but I have to insert it in the English to make sense, but I want to call attention to it as extra words I'm adding. Asa says the audio is breaking up. Is that what you mean? I don't know. I hope you guys can hear me still. So, according to the handbook on Leviticus for Bible translators by the United Bible Societies, they have a series that's put out for people who want to translate the Bible all around the world. Missionaries, for example, translating into untranslated dialects or something. And they claim that this is the most difficult verse in Leviticus. This lo yitama ba'al ba'amav lehechalo. So my Hebrew students, if you struggled with it this week, don't feel bad. Okay, good. Some are chiming in that they hear me. All right, maybe it was just for a bit song. Great. Yofi. Okay, I need to mute someone. I hear somebody's microphone. Right? Okay. Perhaps it's a priest may not attend the funeral of his wife. So it's possible to translate, he, a priest, is a master, i.e. an important person, a Baal. He shall not make himself impure to be polluted among his people. Rashi interprets this as only being the case if she is a wife unfit for a priest. So that a cohen can go to the funeral of his wife as long as he did not sin and marry someone who is used to be a Roman Catholic or something like that, right? So remember, for 2 and 3 generations, a priest, it's a sin for a kohen, a descendant from Aaron today. So if a person's a Levite, and he also claims to be a kohen, a priest, then for 3 generations, some say 4, but for 3 generations, there can be no converts to Judaism in his family line, right? And he himself cannot marry a convert, right? So if someone used to be Roman Catholic and now they've come over to Messianic perspective, that would be considered a convert, right? So you that would ruin the kahuna. It's a sin. The person is living in sin, and they've definitely lost their kahuna. They have no priestly abilities, and they cannot give the Aaronic benediction, etc., etc., etc. All that stuff is gone. This is Rashi saying, in the case that if that wife died, then the Chazal, they think that really this is heaven acting on the priest, and so in that case he should not go to the funeral and make himself impure for that. Because remember, being around dead humans is extreme impurity. It's extreme impurity. A dead body never stops until it's resurrected. It never stops issuing impurity. Even this is why it's very difficult to be a Jewish archaeologist. Right? If you dig up a human bone and you touch the bone, you're impure. Right? You've touched a human remain. Ibn Ezra comments, a master may not defile himself for his household, whether his people be Kohanim or ordinary Israelites, except for the above-mentioned relatives, and thereby become unholy. Extreme separation. So here's our verse again. Extreme separation. I'm calling this slide. Ducha ba'a, to all of you coming in late. Hope your internet will hold strong, and I hope mine will too. Sforno comments that the importance of a priest not being contaminated by a funeral by interpreting the Baal Be'amav as he is a distinguished, that's the Baal, highly placed member of his people. It is his task to teach these laws. Remember, the Kohanim, they used to teach Torah. They taught it to the Melech. They taught it to the Amim, even the Amei Haaretz, even to the ignorance. If they wanted to learn, they would go to the priests and they would learn the Torah. That was part of their job description that they were being supported for. Hezkuni interprets the Targum on this verse that it pertains only to the high priest in relation to a wife of his. So, yeah, and that speaks for itself. The Midrash Agada and Midrash Sifra, oftentimes this is just called the Sifra. If you read something from the sages and they say the Sifra, this is what they mean, Midrash Sifra, concur with Rashi. The Sifra considers the final word lehechalelo, making himself profaned, meaning his children are unfit to be priests because his wife was unfit to be a priest's wife. You see, it doesn't matter if someone has the DNA from Aaron. If anyone in his line that is known for the last 3 generations, including himself, marries a convert, then the line is profane, the line is broken. Any children through that wife will not be Kohanim, and there's no way to undo that for those children. If she dies, he gets another chance, right? He can marry another lady who's actually fit for a Kohen. It's much harder to be a Kohen than to be just normal Am Yisrael. Here's the references in those Midrashim. Burying the dead. So I had the Greek up here, but it just was too crowded. Nuked it. Here's a Hebrew translation from the Greek, and here's my translation from the Greek. So we'll go here. So, burying the dead. One of his Talmudim said to him, speaking to Yeshua, "O Master, allow me first." And I'm reading this because I get a lot of questions on this, even though we've gone over it before. So I thought it's worth touching on this again. "O Master, allow me first to depart and bury my father." But Yeshua said to him, "Follow me and leave it to the dead to bury their dead." That's Besorat Matityahu 8:21 through 22. So there's a nice answer to this in Dr. Stern's Jewish New Testament commentary. So let me just read from his commentary. Don't suppose this would-be Talmud is traveling around with Yeshua while his father's corpse is waiting at home, stinking in the sun. The father is not dead yet. You understand that? This is interesting interpretation Stern has. He's not yet dead. He's not yet dead. If he had been, the son would have been at home, sitting Shiva. See these verses, Yochanan. The son wishes to go home, live in comfort with his father until his death, perhaps years hence, collect his inheritance, and then at his leisure become a disciple. By the way, I'm sharing Stern's opinion because this is different from what I've shared before. Well, I think I shared Stern before, but usually I go take it from another angle. On this and other excuses, see Luke, these verses. Let the spiritually dead, those concerned with the benefits of this world, including inheritances, remain with each other in life and eventually bury their own physically dead. The true Talmud must get his priorities straight. Note the consequences of not doing so at these various verses in Matthew, and these verses in Lucas. I thought that was interesting. This is a usual take, a different take than how I usually interpret this verse. I have to reconsider now. I've read it before, but you forget things. I've always thought that this is saying, look, there's an actual funeral about to happen. And one interpretation I had was maybe the one being called is a Kohen, right? Maybe he's from that line. And Yeshua doesn't want him to violate this commandment, right? And become impure. Because a Kohen is not allowed, except for certain circumstances, to go. You can go for a father, but there would have been the purity issues, right? Or maybe he knew how he'd be delayed or something like this. But I find it interesting, Stern's interpretation. It could be something like this. Maybe he really just wanted to go and make sure he gets his inheritance, and he's thinking, then I'll have money to be a student, right? A lot of people, they do come up with excuses, don't we? Why? Oh, wow. I hope I win the lottery. Then I'll study the Torah every day. Oh, if I could just be rich, every day I'll be in his word. No, you won't. I used to know this guy who was part Hispanic, part black, and he'd say, "Quit lying, quit lying, boy." He'd say that to people in high school. They'd be saying some story, and he'd just break out with this, "Quit lying." So we lie to ourselves, don't we? The truth of the matter is, if we're not studying now, we're not going to be studying when we're on the beach drinking tequilas from the millions that we made in the lottery. Let's just be honest. Even, there's the famous Fiddler on the Roof, right? I don't know how many of you have seen that. If this was in the States, I wouldn't even bother bringing it up because it's almost cliche. But he's got the very famous song. It's actually from a Yiddish. It's from a Yiddish work called Tevye der Milcha, Tevye the Milkman, right? Although in English it's Fiddler on the Roof is the adaptation for the play they made. And anyway, so the main guy, he sings, "If I were a rich man," anyway, and he goes on to say, and at the end of the song he says, "And the sweetest thing of all would be studying the scriptures day and night," right? And this fellow is so ignorant of the Bible in all of his interactions with people that you have to wonder, is it true? Is it really true? Yes, he's a poor farmer, but it's a small community. You can go to synagogue whenever you like. You can get access to the Torah. It's all about priorities. And so it's the same for us. If Stern is correct on his interpretation, or even if he's incorrect, but the motive is still delay, right? Imagine, it really doesn't matter if Stern is right, or if the other interpretations are correct about the Father really is dead, or Yeshua knows something secret about this person that he will delay, or he knows that he's a Levi or something else. The real thing that matters is that there's an opportunity knocking at his door. The Messiah, the Ben Ha-Elohim, the Ben Elohei Chai, is inviting him to study. In those days, it was very competitive to be a student under a rabbi. Very competitive. Oftentimes you had to prove you had the Torah memorized in Hebrew or some other sort of mental qualification to show that you were worthy to be last in the back of the line, let alone sitting at the feet of Gamliel, like Rabbi Shaul tells us. When Rav Shaul says, when Apostle Paul says he used to sit at the feet of Gamliel, what he's telling us is, I was his top student. That's what he's saying. I was at his feet. He permitted me to be up front. Everybody else is in the back, right? There might be a couple people with Shaul on either side. So just to be a student with a normal rabbi was very competitive. Now you have the Messiah, someone who's healing people, someone who's raising people from the dead, all right? If you're going to make an excuse, I need to go bury my father, your priorities are off. Whether he's dead or not. He's dead, he won't know if you're not there, right? I mean, and again, it's not like he won't be buried. Surely he has many siblings. Or he's not dead, and it really is about the inheritance, in which case Yeshua is saving him from going after mammon, because you cannot serve two masters, right? We cannot serve the desire for wealth, which in and of itself is not bad, but at the expense of study, at the expense of swimming in the scriptures, swimming in the words of life, swimming in the words of Mashiach. Let me just check in. Okay. Asa, okay, there's some comment here. Let me see what's going on. Okay. Dr. Verse says, can a Cohen practice polygamy? Yes. There was the one Chazal up above said, a wife of a Cohen has died, right? Of the high priest. I think Chiz Kuni was interpreting, if a wife of the Cohen Hagadol had died. So yeah, why wouldn't you be able to? Yeah, it's biblical culture. We had not yet gone through the period of extreme Europeanization of the Bible. Let's see. And sorry I missed your question before. It wasn't scrolling. I'll catch up with the questions now. Let's see. Sorry, Doc, I don't know the context of the physical and spiritual there because I didn't see it when I was. Esau says, why translate Baal as Kohen? This is just Chazal in the Mikhaot Gedolot. They're interpreting it this way because the verse is extremely terse. Well, the saying, right? And so they're trying to understand what do they mean by this? Surely it does not just mean a husband. You guys understand that many Hebrew words have several nuances based on context, right? And so Baal, this can be a false god. Baal, the thunder god, right? The Canaanite thunder god who later became Thor, to the Nordic peoples, right? That's from Baal. Or this can be a husband, right? Or it can be a master, right? Or someone who possesses a skill. A Baal Chokhmah is someone who's wise, an owner, a possessor of wisdom, right? Or it can be the actual husband of a woman. And so what the Chazal are doing is they're interpreting it that this is probably a kohen, right? Because no one's supposed to impurify themselves, but it seems like it's about death, the passage. And the Targum Onkelos actually interprets it a bit further, and that's what Chizkuni's leaning off. That's why he thinks it's actually for sure a kohen. And of course, that would have been part of the tradition. So Onkelos, of course, was a friend with Rabbi Akiva, and so he also would have been heavily influenced by tradition in making his Aramaic translation. And I did not look at Onkelos, so you might want to check that out, Isa, and let us know. I was only reading the commentary from the sages. What is the sense of tameh? Dr. Vera asks. So, in this case, I think it's regarding burial, right? Contact with the dead. And we do not have to actually touch a dead human in order to be impure from them. According to the Mishnah, our oral interpretation, our oral tradition, if you are in a closed room with a dead body, then you are tameh. It's temuta, it fills the room. If it is outside in an open field, then you have to be within, I think it is 6 umot, that's 6 cubits from it, to be affected by its temuta. Although some say 3. I remember reading that there's some disagreements in the Talmud among this. So open field, it just goes straight up, and then it expands out a bit. So much so that it's even believed that many very serious priests, they will map the flights that an airplane takes, and they be very careful that it doesn't fly over any prominent graveyards, because the concern is that they will intersect the vertical pathward upwards, that the impurity goes upwards. Imagine if you're a Jewish astronaut who's a Kohen, the problems you might have with the orbit of the International Space Station, which is not geosynchronous. Yeah. So, okay. And then Doc said, sorry, I got behind on the comments. He said, okay, let's see. Esau says, Ramon, I personally think many of the laws were given to protect the health of the people, but at the same time, ritualistically, has some spiritual symbolism. Okay. And Doc says, like Tevye in the song, if I were rich. Oh, look at that. I didn't see your comment, but we came to the same conclusion. Very nice. It must have been the Ruach serving up that musical. That says, Chief. Janine says, but there was one instance, Rabbi Yeshua declined a man who to be healed or delivered who applied to be a Talmid of his. Why so? The instance is escaping me right now, Janine. If you could provide reference, that would be very useful. Yeah. But I think there were probably many who Yeshua turned away. It was normal for a normal rabbi to turn some away. Yet Yeshua sometimes called those because he knew the future. He knew that they would be willing to be martyred for God's name. Not everyone is willing to do this. I mean, there have been even false messiahs who converted to Islam to avoid death, like the famous Sabbatai Sevi, who was very, very popular among Jews. And he was doing all kinds of crazy stuff, telling people they could eat pork and stuff, and obviously demonic. And in the end, he converted to Islam. Ha! Yeah, what a false messiah, Yomach Shemo. So, let's see. Yeshua also knows people's hearts. We also find people being turned away later, even after the death of Mashiach, right? Like sometimes people, they just wanted the power of the Holy Spirit, and sometimes they would be chastised or rebuked by the Talmidim. Like it's not for having powers that you can use or for your glory or something like this. So perhaps this is related to what you're asking about, Janine. Sorry that I don't have the reference right offhand. So in our own lives, when you see the opportunity to dive in, to wrestle with the text, and we don't take it, I want to at least today remove from us the lie that if I were rich, I would do it. If I only had lots of time. If. Yeah, I understand there are restrictions, right? But those who really are deeply desirous of His Word, when the time finally opens up, what do? They study His Word, right? They're not yearning for some pastime other than that. They're yearning for that time to be with our Father. And this is a subject we've touched on before, but because of the very power of the Hebrew roots movement, again, they're allies of ours, but errant in some ways, I feel we need to talk about this. Tradition versus Torah. Does Yeshua HaMashiach wholesale attack Jewish tradition? Even among many quote-unquote messianic congregations, this insipid belief has crept up. On the one hand, because it's easy. It excuses us from much study. Right? If we just discount Chazal, then we don't have to study them. We don't have to know what they say. Right? And I think a lot of this was born out of laziness and interacting with Orthodox Jewish brothers. People would be frustrated that they'd bring up something from the Mishnah or from the Talmud or from the Mikrot Gedolot or from the Midrash, and then the Messianic person, Jew, would have no answer. Right? And so when we heard this argument, oh, well, Yeshua's against tradition, the rabbis are just, la 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 la. It's a nice way to be able to say, you know what, I don't have to study. I can just say all that is hogwash. Those guys who studied the Torah for 12 hours a day, what could they possibly know about commandments? So those guys who preserved the Bible for us and the vowel system that we just started using 1,000 years ago, and it's in every single translation of the Bible, it's used, and when the translators look at it and use it, what do they know? It's such a foolish position, but unfortunately a large chunk of Messianics are latching onto this now, as well as the majority of the Hebrew roots movement. And so let's inoculate a little bit. Let's see really what the Messiah is saying, okay? Esau comments, but technically if I don't have to work, I would study. Well, yes, of course. Yeah, that's what I had in mind. People, of course, we do have limited time. That's why I was talking more about the true desire. Those who are enslaved to a certain job, then of course, there's only so many hours in the day, right? But invariably, you still find time to study, don't you? I know you do. I know you, Isa. You find time to study. Yeah, it's not as much as it would be. So it's just interesting when people who don't study hardly at all make the claim, if I were rich, if I won the lottery, if this, if that, if I didn't have kids, if this. No, it's not the case. You don't study now at all. So if you don't study now at all, how could you say more? Yeah. So let's look at this tradition. Let's see how Yeshua handles traditions. Oh man, I thought that was a cool animation, and then it got stuck. I wonder what that bug is where it gets stuck like that. It can't be that much computation happening. I wonder if these PowerPoint slides, if they could come up with a compiler, right? So they could pre-compile the animations instead of having to interpret it on the fly. If that would help. Render, I guess is the right word. Render instead of compile. Talking like a programmer. Okay, so this is from Besorat Lucas 13:10-14. And a didaskonen miaton synagogon. Then he was teaching in one of the synagogues in Tois Sabbasim on the Sabbath, on Shabbat. Kaidu, and behold, look, Gune pnoimo echuisa astanaias eti dekaokto. There was a woman with a spirit having. It's kind of weird, the language. It says, there was a woman, a spirit, possessing, like having, not meaning possessed, having, why is my animation coming up? Having sickness for, these are the number of years, dekaokto, 18 years. Ouch. Kaien sukuptusa, kaime dulamene anakupsai. And she was, and this word is only one time in the entire Bible. And this might be an interesting study if someone wants to do it to find out why is this the only time. And I couldn't find any Hebrew mappings to it either. And it just means that she's bent over. She's bent, right? But it's not one of those Hebrew cognates where bent can mean crooked or something like this. And she was not able to straighten, to make herself straight towards completion. Like she couldn't lean all the way up if she wanted to, right? Like to look at someone in the eye. Idonde alteno Jesus. Seeing her, Yeshua saw her. Prosephonesin. He called out to her. He summoned her. Kaye penalte, and he said to her, Gunai, lady, hey lady, apollelusai tes astanaisu. So let's look at this word, apollelusai. This was interesting to me. Let's see how this maps to the Hebrew, doing our little step through the Septuagint trick. This maps to 4 words in the Tanakh, each one used only one time. The first time this word is used, it's used to translate, it's the word apoleo here. Can you see it? Apoluo, pardon me. It's used to translate, it's translated by halach in Hebrew. This is in Genesis chapter 15, verse 2. Let's look at that. Vayomer Avram, Adonai Elohim, ma titen li, ve'anochi holech aritzi, pardon me, ariri. And Avram said, my master God. It's Adonai Elohim. Notice here the tetragrammaton is pointed with the vowels for God. So we know the tradition is to read it as Elohim. My master God, what will you give to me when I am walking? It's like meaning I'm existing. Ariri. It means I'm without child, unable to have a child. It's interesting. He's blaming it on himself, not on Sarah. Oven Meshech, but the son of Meshech, Beiti is in my house. Hu Damesek, he's presumably from Damascus. Eliezer, his servant Eliezer. So he's saying, look, let him be my heir. He's a good guy, I love him already, he follows Torah, etc. So halach maps to this word that Yeshua is telling the woman to do. He's telling her, apulelusai, halach. Okay? That's a possibility. The other way that it translates from the Hebrew is in Exodus chapter 33, verse 11, as shov. Pardon me, shuv. So what's shuv, guys? What's shuv? Shuvi ami.
Return.
Yeah, return.
Return.
Okay, very good. Return. Please type it though, okay? In Hebrew class we use mics, but not in the Josh, yeah? Okay, thanks. Don't feel bad. It's Shabbat. Don't feel bad. I'm not upset. Just reminding you. It's all right. Yeah, it's hard to go. I think the elders who teach in the mornings don't mind open mics, right? And then tomorrow we'll have open mics. And so it's got to be really tough for you guys to remember. In the morning you're able to talk, and now I'm like, silence! I don't want to hear you. Just kidding. I like hearing your voices, but because these are going to go public and stuff, I just don't want your voices out there on YouTube. Yeah. Okay. So shuv, first Shemot 33:11. Let's look at this one. V'diber Adonai el Moshe. Then Hashem spoke to Moshe, panim el panim, face to face. So we know this is actually Yeshua speaking to him, right? Because the Father doesn't meet with someone face to face. Because why? They will melt. Okay? The melt. He tells Moshe, you cannot look at me face to face. You cannot see my glory directly head on. Only when he puts Moshe in the cleft of the rock and he passes by and you look after me, then you can see my kavod. And the kavod Adonai is Yeshua. That is his kavod. This is why Paul says, I glorify, in the Messiah. You understand? He uses this terminology because Mashiach is the kavod Adonai. And in many scriptures, the rabbis interpret the kavod Adonai as being a hint about the Mashiach, that he would be his kavod, his glory, his honor would be the Messiah. So this is pre-incarnate Yeshua. When Moshe would speak to him face to face, I understand this to mean he's speaking with Yeshua. And then there's also no contradiction in the text. Like a person who speaks a man unto his neighbor, right? This actually just means one another, the Hebrew idiom. And here it is, the red word. This is where it translates into the Greek. Septuagint apoluo. Veshav el hamachaneh umishalto Yehoshua bin Nun. Then he returned unto the camp, and Joshua, his minister, the son of Nun, Na'ar, the lad, lo yamish mitoch ha'ohel. And then he did not depart from the inside of the tent after that. Okay, so let's see how else is it used. One time it's used as this word, gavah, which is to expire. Right, to expire. So let's have a look. Gavah is in Numbers chapter 20, verse 29, where it says, Vayiru kol ha'eda hi gavah Aharon, vayivku et Aharon shaloshim yom kol Beit Yisrael. Okay, let's see. Okay, great. Someone just told me privately they had some technical difficulties. They're here now. I figured that was happening since my quote-unquote fiber line wasn't working. So I just have to laugh every time. Oh, the fiber's out. It's funny to tell people back in the States. Fiber's down. What? How does fiber go down? Would you guys have a snowstorm in the Philippines? No. Just lots of people in the neighborhood probably using internet. Yeah. Okay, thanks for that. But just so you know, brother, you're posting it to me in private, those definitions. I didn't know if you wanted to share those Strong's numbers with people or not. Yeah? Okay, so ki gava Aharon. So all of the congregation, they saw that Aharon had expired. And this actually, we learned from the Akkadian, this word gawa has to do with breath, right? And so it's the loss of breath. They're no longer breathing. His neshama has left him. Vayivku, and they cried concerning Aharon for 30 days. Who did? All of the house of Israel. Okay, and then our last word, which maps to apolluo, is garash. Psalm 33, verse 1. Let's have a look at that. LeDavid b'shanoto et ta'amo lifnei Avimelech. So this is a mizmor of David. This means change, from shanat, he changed. Ta'amo doesn't mean his taste, its appearance. He changed his taste, he changed his appearance before Avimelech. V'garashehu v'yelach. And he drove him out, and he left, and he halacht, right? He went. So it's interesting, this little sampling, these are the only 4 times in Tanakh that the rabbis translated, they use this word in the translation Septuagint. And the only really common element I could find between them was that they're pretty serious circumstances. In Genesis 15:2, it's about the hair. It's about the heir, right? It's about who would become Israel, basically, right? And in his state of not having an heir, this is what Avram Avinu is talking about. In Exodus 33:1, it's after an extreme experience with God, right? So Avram's also experiencing God in this moment, right? He's also experiencing. But in this case, it's the Mashiach pre-incarnate, probably, the way that I understand it. The Malach Hashem. Panim el panim is not with the Father. Nobody can do this. That's why the Bible can honestly say no one has seen God, meaning the Father, face to face, right? But then here it says Moshe spoke panim el panim. So it's not a conflict when you understand that this is with the Mashiach. He's speaking with the Ben Elohim, the one which is the Yachid, the monogenos. Okay? And then afterwards, the word used is he's returning, right? He's returning to his camp, right? So that's something, it's interesting because Holech and Shav, they both have to do with motion as well in these interactions with God. The third one, our example from Numbers, is involving the entire assembly, the entire congregation, in the death of the high priest, the Kohen Hagadol, who is, of course, a type of the Mashiach. With his life, Aaron is a symbol of the Messiah, right? In fact, even the older biblical Hebrew word for the high priest is simply HaMashiach. HaMashiach, the anointed one of the people, is the high priest, right? But HaMashiach also means Messiah. And then the final verse we had is a life-saving moment, where again, it's tied to the Messiah. Had Avimelech recognized David HaMelech and slayed him, Yeshua's ancestor would have been wiped out. And so we have this interesting connection, this use of words. It almost seems to me like it was planted there in the Greek just so that we could see this connection to what he's telling this woman. And so then Yeshua, he gives her the life-giving statement. He says to her, not in Greek, but this is how it's recorded, and I don't know which one of the words he chose there. I suspect it was probably shuv, some form of shuv, or even halach. Certainly he's not saying to expire. He could be telling the spirit to be driven out, to garash. We have it recorded that he said, apolyelusai, tes astenai Yesu. Kai epethikin aute tascheres. So he tells her, go out your sickness. Then, it's probably then, like Hebrew Vav instead of and, Kai. He set tascheres. This is interesting. The Greek just says the hand. He set the hand. Now, in Psalms Hebrew, if you talk about a human body part, you don't have to say his. You don't have to say your. This also happens in Ugaritic with body parts, and it happens in older Hebrew like Psalms. So oftentimes in Psalms it'll just say the hand, meaning your hand, right, or my hand, or it'll just say rosh when the speaker means my head, right? You don't have to put a pronoun attached to a body part in older Hebrew or in Ugaritic in those languages. And it's interesting to see it coming across this in the Greek, right? In the Greek, it should have said his hand, but it just says the hand. Epithekein, this is from tithemai, to set or to place, so probably seam in Hebrew. He placed on her tascheiras, the hand. So I don't know, it's neat to me when you see the Semitic flavor coming through into the Greek. Proof that there's a Hebrew original. Kai paracheme anothrofe, kai edoxadsen tontheon. And this word here, paracheme, this is like pitom in Hebrew, like suddenly, instantly. Anothothe, she straightened up. Or rather, it's passive. She was straightened, like something's happening on her. It's not saying that she did it in and of herself. This theta tells us it's a passive. Passively, it happened. She was made straight. Kai, and what does she do? Then, Hebrew then, from Vav. Vav can mean then in Hebrew, not just I and. Edotzatsen, she glorified Tontheon, the God. She gave glory to God. So you can see what kind of person this was. This is a person filled with gratitude who reacts properly. Okay, let me see what some of you wrote here. We've got some stuff. Okay, thank you, Yomar, for sharing that with everyone. And he, as the radiance of his glory and the exact representation of his nature in Hebrews 1:3, nice. Yep, Dr. Vera climbs in Yeshua. Yeah, I agree. Yep, the panim el panim, probably that was, right? And then Janine says, Rabbi Yirmi, Natalie and I found the former demon-possessed man Yeshua delivered and sent home. Mark 5:1-20. Oh, right, okay. Yeah, great. Of course he's not going to take someone as a Talmid, though, who is demon-possessed. Right? I don't know if Yeshua purified him when he did this, but for sure, whatever the person did to get him demon-possessed, it's not like you've got a great person who's keeping the Torah and worshiping God every day, and suddenly a demon like comes inside that person, right? It doesn't happen. He was doing some bad stuff, right? This might be the man who was living in the graveyard, I think you're talking about, right? I mean, come on. You disrespect God's purity laws so much that you're going to live in a graveyard? There's other places to live, okay? So it's almost asking for it. Thanks for finding that reference. Yeah, so this is a reason he would not take him as a Talmid. Because think about the person's sin life up to this point, right? He doesn't take the tax collectors either, right? You don't typically have tax collectors. So there's only special circumstances when Yeshua recognizes complete teshuvah. When he sees the completeness of the teshuvah on the person and he realizes the true potential they have, then he invites them in. But it seems like most of his Talmidim, they're not like, quote unquote, living in sin, right? Yomar, thanks for sharing that. Those Strong's numbers and the mappings to the Hebrew words. Very nice. So, yep, that's good. Those are the same Hebrew words I put up. Thank you. Very good. Excellent. Janine says he cast out 7 demons out of Miriam. Thanks for that, everybody. Continuing on. Okay, so now what happens? Yeshua did a great thing. Apokritheis deho archisunagogos. The day here connects a thought. So then, or but, the leader of the synagogue answered, Aganakton hotitos sabato. He was furious because it was concerning the Sabbath. Because Yeshua had healed on the Sabbath. And again, he said to Ochlo, dative to the crowd, hotiex hemerai asin and ice de ergadzestai. Six days there are in which it is possible to ergadzestai, to do ergos, to work. And altais, in those ones, you should erchomenoi come, therapeusis, to be healed. Kai me, but not tehemera, to sabatu, not on the Shabbat, the day of the Shabbat, Yom HaShabbat. Okay, so he's ticked, right? He's ticked. The president of the synagogue is ticked off. So Yeshua is there teaching by invitation, presumably, right? He's teaching, and then this happens, and he heals the woman, right? Because it says, "Ein de didaskon en miates." Okay, so he was teaching in one of the synagogues, and through Sabbaton on the Sabbath, right? So quite an honor. He's been invited to teach on Shabbat, and now the president, this bureaucrat. When it says the ruler of the synagogue, look, these are not usually rabbis. This is not a rabbi. Okay, the ruler of the synagogue is the president. This is usually how it works with synagogue structures. I'm not 100% sure that it was the same back then, but the one in charge of the synagogue hires the rabbi. You see, like a local community, they chip in loot, and then they hire a rabbi, and the rabbi shows up, right? Like that. So, like we used to have a president back at the synagogue we started in Texas, and then they. We had a certain income, and we invited a rabbi. We could only afford him once a month. He would come and he would teach once a month, right? And the rest of the time it was just us kind of teaching ourselves. And then we could fire him also. It's kind of there's all kinds of stuff that happens with the board and the rabbi. It's not necessarily great. But here we see Yeshua is the rabbi, and this guy is causing him trouble. Let's switch to English. Then the Lord answered him. This is ESV now. It's not my translation. You hypocrites, hypocritai in the Greek. Does not each of you on the Shabbat untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to water it? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 years, be loosed from the bond on Shabbat? Like, what better day than Shabbat for this glory to the Lord to happen? As he said these things, all his adversaries were put to shame, and all the people rejoiced at the glorious things that were done by him. So the Greek actually says, "Hosatanas." So the translation doesn't do that, right? So of course this is kind of an issue of captured since birth, right? It's hard for them to see things this way. So it's thus Satan, Abraham, whom thus Satan bound, this daughter of Abraham, whom thus Satan bound for 18 years. The Hebrew captures it correctly in this old translation from the 1800s, the Sarkinson Ginsburg. See in blue, it says Hasatan, right? It's not a name, right? It's not the devil. This is the Satan, right? The adversary to humanity who serves the Lord. Any comments or questions before we go on? This is my translation from the Greek from Mark 3, 1 through 6. And he entered again into the synagogue, and there was a man who had a paralyzed or a dry hand. It can mean either of those things. And they observed him. If on the Shabbat, he will heal him. So they could bring charges against him to the Beit Din. And he said to the man with the paralyzed or dry hand, I couldn't decide, get up to the middle. He then said to them, is it kosher to do good on Shabbat or to do wrong? To save life or to kill? But they did not make a sound. Just imagine the crickets. Cheep, cheep, cheep. Verse 5. So he looked around at them angrily, grieved about the obstinacy of their minds. He said to the man, stretch out the hand. See, again, here it's quite literal, but probably I could say your hand. Right? So it's like the Hebrew in Psalms does. So he extended it, and his hand was restored. Then the Shama'ites immediately stormed out and assembled as a council with the Herodians to cause his destruction. So why did I translate Shama'ites here? Anybody have an idea? The text says Pirushim, the Pharisees. But I believe the Gentile Greek text has lost the original nuance. It's kind of like if I said today, imagine, okay, Brother Tom went to meet with a certain group of people, and there were members from the Protestants there who would not hear his words about the Torah, and they left angrily. Okay, now if I just say the Protestants, okay, it's probably true that they were Protestants. He wasn't meeting with Roman Catholics, but maybe they were Pentecostals, right? Maybe they were Charismatics. Maybe they were Sabbath-keeping Baptists. There is such a group, right? Maybe they were Seventh-day Adventists. Right? So it's a little overbroad to just say the Protestants, isn't it? And so in this case, I understand, based on understanding who these groups were and what they believed, that usually Yeshua was not fighting with Hillelites, because we have evidence that he accepted a prayer written by Rabbi Hillel, which is the Lord's Prayer. Our Father who is in heaven, etc., etc., etc. This is a Hillelite prayer written before Yeshua, and Yeshua accepts the subpart of it. He takes part of it. He says, this is the way to pray. He's hinting to his disciples, pray like the Hillelites pray. Have their attitude. So the Hillelites, Rabbi Hillel was very forgiving, right? Like, if you'd had a life of sin and you want to come back, welcome back to the fold. Go and sin no more, right? This is the attitude of Rabbi Hillel. Rabbi Shammai, who was theologically opposed to the teachings of Rabbi Hillel, was very unforgiving. Get out of my sight, you sinner! You know, it's like it's a very, very, very hard sect to return to make teshuvah with. Very unforgiving. And it's interesting because we learn in the Talmud that after the Hillelites took power of the Sanhedrin, in a single day they overturned almost every single halakhic decision. That's Jewish law decision that was made by the Shama'ites. Look at this, isn't that amazing? And so it's my understanding, based on the timeline, that usually the Pharisees, it's not really good to say Pharisee in English because you're missing the nuance that would have been understood by first century believers. I haven't seen any other translations do this, so maybe I'm wrong. You know, I could be wrong, but it's my opinion, it's the Shama'ites. Because, you know, you'll find the Talmud is always making fun of the Shama'ites. You know, how with their hardness of hearts, their opinions, and all these sorts of things. And I really think it makes sense that it's the Shama'ites and the Tzadokim, the Sadducees, the Sadducees, they reject the Tanakh. They only accepted the Torah, right? So they rejected most of the Bible. So already they're on a horrible path. So it's no wonder that they would then fight with the one who's prophesied in the Nach, largely, i.e. Yeshua. So people, they make a mistake when they assume it's all Orthodox Jewry, for example. Modern Orthodox Jewry is descended from Rabbi Hillel. Even though some of the teachings of Shammai are still studied, Shammai is seen as vastly inferior to Hillel. Doc, who's the devil in which verse? Sorry. Oh, the one about that we were just reading before, in the one just prior about the Satan. It's not the devil. It's actually the Satan. It's actually the one who serves God. So for God's purpose of glory, this woman's back was made bent all those years, so that the glory of the kingdom. And we see this model in other places, right? Like with the blind man, when the Talmidim, the disciples, they ask Yeshua, why was this man made blind? Was it because of his sin or his parents' sin, right? They're assuming wrongly, as many believers do today, they assume that every sickness is because somebody sinned, right? Which is just nuts if you know anything about microbes. So they're making this assumption. And Yeshua says it's not because of his sins or his parents' sins, but so that God might be glorified today. And then Yeshua heals the blind man, right? Because the blind man, he says, what do you want from me? And the blind man says, I want to see, right? I want to see. He asks for the impossible, right? He doesn't say, give me some food, I'm starving, man, right? Which is usually what you would expect from a blind person in those days, right? They had to really beg just to survive. Instead, he understands, he can feel something is different in the air. He knows there's someone there that can actually do something, and he asks, he goes for it. He just goes for it. He says, I want to see. And so he sees. He sees. And so the same is true in this case. That's why the text tells us it's ho satana in the Greek. When the Greek uses the article ho satana, then we know that it's the Satan. When it just says satana as a proper noun, then this is the title that Yeshua actually attached permanently to the devil, to the Nachash. So the Nachash he now has this title. That's where it gets confusing. He now has the title adversary, basically, Yeshua's calling him. Because think about it, Yeshua, the Son of God, he's saying, you're not just the adversary, meaning the district attorney that I send against humans to test them. You are my adversary. To humans, the Satan is adversary as well, right? He's not looking out for the good of us. His job is to tempt us, right? To make sure that we're tested properly. But the one whom Yeshua calls adversary, this is the adversary to God, and that's the Nachash. That is the serpent in the garden. That is Halal ben Shachar, the fallen one, the one who fell from the sky. Right. That's who he's talking about. So the distinction in the Greek here is ha-satana, and we saw in the Hebrew translation ha-satan, right? Which is in Hebrew you don't do this with people's names, right? Like you wouldn't say ha-Yeshua, right? The Yeshua, right? We say Germans do that. It's kind of weird sometimes, but you say ha. Satan means it's not the name. It's not someone with the title Satan, but he's the office keeper of the district attorney or whatever. And then Dr. Vera says, you are of your father the devil. And you want, okay, this is the Nachash. Yeah, okay, I see, thank you. And this is Dr. Vera's writing this. And you want to do the desires of your father. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth because there is no truth in him. Whenever he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own nature, for he is a liar and the pater pseudopigraphes, the father of lies. That's in Basurat Yochanan 8:44, and that was from the NASB translation. Thanks for that. Yeah, that's the Nachash. That is not the Satan. That is just Satan. In other words, the devil, not the Satan. Yeah, good question. The Satan loves God. Satan does not love God. See? One is a rebel, one is a servant. Yeah, and it's really important to know these things because, again, if any of you interact with other people who aren't believers, or you're into apologetics, they're going to find apparent contradictions in the text, and people, they fail these debates and arguments because they don't understand the difference between the Satan and Satan, or the Satan and the devil, diabolos in the Greek. So the Shama'ites immediately stormed out, that particular group of Pharisees. Just like it's not fair to say that Brother Tom was interacting with Protestants. It's true, but it misses the nuance. In the day, it would have been understood, the Shama'ites. It's the Shama'ites, right? The majority Pharisees in that day. The ones who had the power of the Sanhedrin in that moment. Then the Shama'ites immediately stormed out and assembled as a council with the Herodians to cause his destruction. Hillelites would not have met with Herodians, according to their theology. You shouldn't sit down with such a person. Oh, hold on, I think my computer got unplugged. Let me check something real quick. Yeah, moment. Okay, Yofi. Okay. Yeah, let's skip this one for now. I'm going a bit long. You can take a screenshot if you're interested in that. I'm going to change in 5 seconds. Okay. Was Yeshua HaMashiach against titles? The next day, again, John was standing with two of his disciples, and he looked at Yeshua as he walked by and said, "Behold the Lamb of God." Here it is. Ide ho amnos tutheu. Behold. Hine. The two disciples hearing him say this, and they followed Yeshua. Yeshua turned and saw them following and said to them, "What are you seeking?" Like, what do you want? And they said to him, "Rabbi," which means teacher, "where are you staying?" He said to them, "Come and you will see." So the reason for reading this verse to you is the same groups that oftentimes are against us using any kind of interpretation from the rabbis. They will also tell us that we should not use titles such as rabbi or father or something like that we should not have this among our leadership. And so oftentimes they get asked about this, right? Being ordained and all that stuff. So, why the title rabbi? Clearly, there's another spot in Scripture where Yeshua is saying, "Don't let any man call you rabbi or father or teacher," right? And so the response is, well, look, is the Messiah a hypocrite? Or do we learn by his example? They said to him, "Rabbi." Did he say, "Hey, don't call any man rabbi"? No. The context is important. And so when he talks about titles, it's really funny too. I've had pastors smugly tell this to my face. "Hey, why are you called rabbi? But doesn't it say blah, blah, blah?" And I just kind of was thinking, wow, how can you be so arrogant, man? Don't you realize if there was a title pastor at that moment, he would have said, "or pastor"? It's like, why do you think that at small Filipino churches, there's 13 guys with the title pastor? And a lot of them, they haven't read the whole Bible. I've been amazed when I talk to, "Oh, you're a pastor?" I used to be so naive. "Oh, you're a pastor? Oh, great." And we get chit-chatting, and it occurs to me that the guy never read the Bible even. Maybe he read some, but never even one time through. Not even one time through in translation. There's just like, the nose is bleeding, right? And so this is, I think, what Yeshua is talking about. Title inflation for the sake of our ego. Right? This is not supposed to be, because he goes on to explain, "For they love to be called rabbi, rabbi in the marketplaces," right? In front of people. "Look how great you are. You got this title. Oh, yes, you also have the title. We're so great." That's clearly what it's about. It's just so funny to me, though, that actually many times I've heard this from pastors, and they don't mind being called pastor. It's like, man, could you be more blind? Look at what he's teaching in the verse. He himself is called rabbi, and he doesn't tell people not to say it. He leads by example more than anyone ever has led by example. The WWJD bracelets I like to talk about. What would Yeshua do? The point is, it should not be an ego thing. It should be a servant thing to remind you that you're a servant. If you have any kind of scholastic title, teacher or rabbi or pastor or shamash, or whatever, like deacon, whatever the title is, it's about serving others, right? It's and it's just important in our society because it helps us to filter out kind of quickly. Well, it should help to filter out who is able to answer something biblically and who's not, right? And again, you can have no title and be able to answer, right? It's just, this is the way society uses it. But for people to take it and to make it into pride, the whole purpose of studying religious scripture is to be closer to God, to be more humble, to have better midot, right? Not to think that we're so great because we have some kind of bureaucratic title, right? So this is what Yeshua is talking about. So I thought that I should address this in the context of, was Yeshua really against all the traditions? So he's not arguing with the Hillelites, i.e. the fathers of current modern Orthodox Jews. He's in all likelihood arguing with the Shama'ites from that sect, right? So they're the same sect, but in the same way that oneness Pentecostals are the same sect as super charismatics. Okay, it's the same sect, but not really, right? Or the same as Baptists are the same as charismatics. Well, not really the same sect, is it? Or Methodists, or Episcopalians, right? Technically are Protestants, though they have, special priests, we'll just say, and they allow marriage between certain forbidden marriages. So there's a broad spectrum. So we need to be careful in parsing this before we come to conclusions about who we should be listening to and who we don't listen to. Dr. Bear, did I answer your question okay? The one about the devil who's being spoken out there? What is this tradition of the elders? I like the way that Delitzsch translates this here for any of you who read Hebrew. He talks about the Netolat yedehem leseuda, right? So the washing of the hands before a religious meal, right? So this, of course, is today we just call it the netilat yadayim, right? When you take the two-handled cup and you pour the water 3 times over each hand, left and the right, and the left and right, left and right, and you say the bracha, right? That's what it's talking about. Right? This particular commandment. Not commandment, interpretation of something that was believed to be a command in those days. And so Yeshua takes us on. So let's look at the English. Then Pharisees and scribes, so again I'm going to say Shama'ites, came to Yeshua from Yerushalayim and said, "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders?" I believe this is ESV I have up in front of you. "For they did not wash their hands when they ate." Okay, so huge mistake. If you are new, visiting for the first time, or if you're watching this video later, a lot of those born in Gentile traditions, those captured since birth, they assume that this is a law in our Torah, right? That you must do this netilat yadayim before you eat, right? And they don't understand that this was an interpretation. This is a tachinah, right? Even if you ask an Orthodox person today, they'll say that's not from the Torah, that's from the rabbis, right? There's always a distinction among, when Orthodox are discussing mitzvot, commandments, they'll say amongst themselves, this is what's amazing to me, that some of the Hebrew roots have the gall to say, like, it's the rabbis. Well, even Jews today distinguish between something from the Torah and something from the rabbis. It's much, much weaker if it's from the rabbis. If it's from the Torah, then of course it's from the prophet of God. There's no way around it. If the Torah said, wash your hands before you eat, then Yeshua for sure would have slapped his disciples in the back of the head. What are you doing? Why would you sin like that? Right? Instead, he's challenging them on this tradition. Right? He's like, you have a particular tradition here, and maybe even it's not even considered seuda, that particular meal that they're having. So he answered them, why do you break the commandment of God? So this is really funny for those who think that Yeshua was okay with people breaking the mitzvot, right? Oh, it's just a what is it? It's just, I can't think of the word. Like for procedure, it's just a procedural commandment. I know it's just a. I told you not to use the term, and I can't even remember the term now. Fine, it's just for ritual purity, right? So, but instead, he's very strict. You break the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition, but it's a serious commandment. For God commanded, "Kibed et avicha v'et imecha," and whoever reviles father or mother, mot yumat, must be executed. But you say, if anyone tells his father or his mother, what you would have gained from me is given to God, meaning I decide to tithe instead of giving to you, he need not honor his father. So for the sake of your tradition, i.e. the tithing of the mint, etc., right? There's the way that they interpret the second tithe. You have made void the word of God. Yahoo 15:1-6. So what's really happening here? Is Yeshua saying every interpretation that the Pharisees have of what is legal, what is not legal is wrong? No. In fact, there are very, 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 very few examples of their interpretations which he strikes down. That's fascinating because they strike each other's interpretations down all over the place. If you read the Talmudic debate, all over the place. A lot of great sages disagree about, do we light the menorah from the left or the right, or from the right to the left, or, is it all candles the first day and then we count down and there's only one left, or do we start with one? There's a lot of discussion and thought that goes into the best way to apply mitzvot. And there's only a handful that Yeshua strikes down. I challenged one time in a forum some people, some Hebrew roots guys. Again, Hebrew roots, love you guys. Don't. If you're listening to this and you're from the Hebrew roots, don't think wrong. We're allies, right? You love the Torah, great. Okay? But, you might want to ask your older brother sometimes how to do this stuff instead of just reinventing the wheel, right? Every time. You don't have to do that. There is a chain of tradition from all the way to the days of Messiah and after him, right? Which has been kept. So I remember trying to make the case for them that, look, maybe I won't tell the story. Oh, yeah, okay, fine. I challenged them. I said, anybody find me 10 places in the apostolic writings where Yeshua strikes down traditions? Just find me 10. in the entire book of the apostolic writings. And then maybe you can make the case that he was against all tradition, right? Because so many guys are like, oh, that's tradition, right? It's a bad word to them if something's tradition right away. So I challenge anybody who's against this. Find me 10 places where Yeshua does it. I think you will have trouble finding 5 even. If we're extremely liberal in what we interpret, maybe 7. Maybe 7. I even helped them out a little bit with a few. All right. Matityahu 12, 1-6. This is that same verse saying that Yeshua was walking and there was standing grain. It was on the Shabbat and his disciples were hungry. And so they plucked from the juicy part in their hands and they ate from the corn. And some of the Pirushim they salt, although I would have liked to have injected into here the Shama'ites, but this is the Hebrew New Testament, which is a Christian translation. Haloka tema asa David. So his answer is, So then they annoyed at him, right? And they said to him, look, your disciples, they're acting, doing that which is not done on Shabbat, right? So there's no tradition of the elders or anything mentioned in this. And he said to them, did Haloka tema asem David? Have you not read that which David did? Kasher ha'ev, when he was hungry? The ele asher ito, and those who were with him? This is when he's fleeing from Shaul, right? And he gets the sword of Goliath, and they eat the lechem hapanim that the priest had. Asher ba'al beit Elohim, he went to the house of God. V'yochal et lechem hapanim, and he ate the shoe bread, the older translations. Asher al pi haTorah, which is in front of the Torah. Which is according to the Torah. Lo yochal, you should not eat it. Well, now Rav and his lads, biliti im hakohanim, but only the kohanim, levadam, are supposed to. So what Yeshua is doing is he's making a halachic argument, which is just amazing to me that we can come to the conclusion that the Torah, that people can conclude it doesn't matter anymore, or it's not to be observed, because Yeshua is always very careful to pit Torah against Torah. If there's something which is being violated, which is a traditional interpretation, that is a rabbinical tachana, or something which he feels is a possible commandment violation, but there's justification, he makes the justification in rabbinical style. And that's what's happening here. This is how a rabbi would argue with another rabbi. He's saying, look, David violated Shabbat because they were hungry. Now, it's not just because they're hungry. This doesn't mean like you got some hunger pains on Shabbat, it's okay to eat pork because that's what's nearby, right? Okay, no. David is fleeing for his life. And they would have understood the context, right? Saul wants to kill him, okay? That's the context. They might have to fight Saul and his army. Now, if you didn't have food for a few days, will you fight well, or will you get tired after an hour of fighting? What do you think? Warfare, hand-to-hand combat, is extremely energy intensive. So, David understands they must have some kind of energy, even if it's just bread. So he feeds, they eat, and they take the sword that is stored there, right? So they're getting weapons and food. It's clear what's on David's mind. God wants us to live. And so even though only the priest should eat this, we're going to eat it. It's the only food around. We might have to fight Saul. And that's the point Yeshua makes. Megam halokra atem, have you also not read about Torah in the Torah? Ki ha-kohanim ha-mikdash yichalelu et yom ha-shabbat. That the kohanim in the sanctuary, they violate, they profane the Shabbat, meaning they do things that are accordance of work, like they start fires and stuff. It's allowed because it's a special provision just for that place. But it doesn't count to them as guilt. But I say to you, that there is one who is here who is greater even than the sanctuary. Right? So he's saying, I know how to interpret the Torah. Don't worry about it, guys. I'm interpreting properly. It's not saying your traditions don't matter, your interpretations don't matter, your studies and the decisions of the Batei Din don't matter. None of that is what he's saying. That when people try to overreach in this way, they are trying to be a little too clever. They're extending a little bit too far. It's more than what the verse says. Is everybody still with me? I don't see many comments for a while. It wasn't scrolling again. Dag nabbit. Sorry, guys. This go to meeting. Sometimes it doesn't scroll the comments. Okay, so Esau chimed in, since Yeshua's disciples were Jews and prayer is a huge part of Jewish life, how come they asked Yeshua to teach them how to pray? Would you expect that they have learned how to pray when they were young boys by the bar mitzvah? Excellent question. And this comes right into what I was teaching about the Shama'ites and why my translation says the Shama'ites. The reason is there were dueling sects in those days. Just like you have different denominations of Christianity, there were different denominations of Judaism in those days. Like I said, the Sadducees, they even didn't accept the Nach, the prophets and the writings. They only accepted the Torah. Right? And then within the Perushim, the dominant sect, you had the Hillelites and the Shama'ites. So what they're asking him is, who's right? Do we pray like the Shama'ites or do we pray like the Hillelites? And Yeshua answers by what? He uses a Hillelite prayer. So he gives them the go-ahead. Hillel is the one who's right. You see? That's what's happening. It's a great question. I wish I'd seen it when I was talking about that. Okay? Does that answer your question, Lisa? I hope that's good. Dr. Era says, who is the devil in this passage? You are the father, you are of your father, the devil, and you want to do that. Whenever he talks about your father, the devil, he's talking about the diabolos, the actual devil. Yeah. Pater Pseudos, the father of lies. Yes, so they were praying the Jewish prayers. Yes. The question was, which Jewish prayers? Right? There was an established, monolithic, accepted way to do it. There was a battle, in-house battle with the Pharisees between the Shama'ites and the Hillelites. And then you actually have other groups like the Essenes who said, you know what, these guys are all wicked, I'm out of here. Right? And they moved out into the desert because they saw that the priesthood was corrupted by the ones who rejected the Nach. You got people in the priesthood who don't even believe in the whole Bible, right? So kind of like Martin Luther's Bible, right? They removed part of the Bible. We're out of here. So the Essenes, they got out of Jerusalem. They moved out because they were afraid that God was going to have vengeance on the city, which he did do. They were right. He did have vengeance on the city. He let the Romans come in and destroy it. Okay, cool. Dr. Bear says, yes. Thanks a lot, teacher. Okay, Baruch Hashem. Okay, good. Good comments, questions. It should be scrolling now. I'll be more careful to watch. I've been trying to see if you guys write anything, and it wasn't scrolling. I thought, wow, nobody's commenting. Okay, when is it too burdensome? That's the title of this next slide. So I want to share with you guys how Rav Shaul, in common parlance, the Apostle Paul, kept the commandments and the traditions. If you don't believe me, go read Acts. Read Acts, again, written by Lucas. Well, after being saved. Okay? So after Shaul got saved, after he saw the light, he kept keeping the traditions, as is testified in the book of Acts. So maybe I'd recommend his level of observance is the level that's not too burdensome, right? Because people sometimes say, well, what's too burdensome? It's too hard to keep the Torah. It's so burdensome. It's such a burden. So it's not so hard, really, guys. Really, it's not so hard. Maybe at first there's a lot to learn, right? Can those of you speak up? Those of you who have been keeping the Torah for a long time. Oh, the audio connection's lost. Golly.